Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Considerations for Patient Diversity in Cardiovascular Clinical Trials. My name is Sydney, and I'll be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Medpace, who developed the content for this presentation. Medpace is a scientifically driven, global, full-service clinical contract research organization providing phase 1 through 4 clinical development services to the biotechnology, pharmaceutical, and medical device industries. Medpace's mission is to accelerate the global development of safe and effective medical therapeutics through its high science and disciplined operating approach that leverages local regulatory and deep therapeutic expertise across all major areas, including oncology, cardiology, metabolic disease, endocrinology, central nervous system, and antiviral and anti-infective. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Dr. Srinivas is an interventional cardiologist bringing over 10 years of experience in clinical practice, academia, and clinical research. He served as director of the University of Cincinnati HLVI Center for Structural and Adult Congenital Heart Disease and section head of the UC Catheterization Lab. Dr. Metelier is a cardiologist in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is affiliated with multiple hospitals in the area, including hospitals of the University of Pennsylvania Penn Presbyterian and Penn Presbyterian Medical Center. She received her medical degree from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and has been in practice for 17 years. Dr. Sampaio has over 8 years' experience in patient recruitment management at the site level. She has managed a global team of strategic partners, support staff, and vendors for multi-million-dollar global marketing, patient recruitment, and patient retention campaigns. She received her medical degree from Federal University in Bahia in Salvador, Brazil. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to our first speaker. Satya, you may begin when ready.
Sydney, thank you so much. And thank you to the attendees for joining us today. Your presence here is the first step in focusing on diversity and focusing on inclusion. So we're very, very grateful that you've taken time out of your day to spend time with us talking about these important issues. Next, please. The agenda will be fairly straightforward. There are 3 big questions we'd like to answer and we'd like you to focus on. Why should we care about diversity and equity? I think this is important. While I think a lot of us can answer this question fairly easily, I think going through some of the data and tying it in to our focus on quality and efficiency. The goal here is to deliver cutting-edge innovative therapy to those patients that need it, the right drug, the device, at the right patient, for the right patient at the right time. And to do that, I think diversity plays a large role. We'll follow that up with a dive into history and observation of pain points for why this hasn't occurred in clinical trials. It's easy to say we should care, but understanding why this has been hard is an important thing to cover. And then we'll finish up, very importantly, with solutions to promote patient diversity. Next slide, please. Next slide. The first question I'd like to have us ponder over is, where are we now when it comes to just overall population, overall diversity in the United States? If you look back to the 1990s and 2000s, the data that's even before what's being displayed currently, the white non-Hispanic population was close to 70%. In 2010, this dropped to 63.8%, and in 2020, this is less than 60%. Put another way, if you don't have a plan to drive enrollment for the other 40% of the US population, you are already starting with the glass half full. Enrollment will be slower. Efficiency won't be what you expect it to be. Next slide, please. While that's important to understand where we were and where we are now, what we really want to get at is, where are we going? in terms of the US population. By 2045, white non-Hispanic population will be less than 50% of the US population. Now you say, well, 2040, 2045 is a long time away, but if you think about it, if you're starting a new biotech right now, you've got some IP that's going through phase 1. That phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that program of development will take the next 5 to 7 years, let's say, and then you'll hope to have 10 to 15 years of commercial viability at the very least. We need to know where the population will be for our products when they're going to be commercial, if for no other reason. And so by 2040, 2045, diversity in the US population will be mostly minorities. This has resulted in the FDA emphasizing the need for diversity, this amongst other things, emphasizing the need for diversity in clinical trials. After the white non-Hispanic population, the Hispanic and the Black non-Hispanic populations are the two largest groups, and the group that's growing very, very fast is the Asian population. Next slide, please. But it's one thing to say that the US diversity will change, the US population will change and become more diverse. I think we have to go one layer even deeper and say, is that going to be a uniform change? If you're just looking in the Northeast or the Pacific Northwest, diversity is not uniform. Geography plays a large role. These maps show the Black US population on the left, and the map on the right shows the density of the Hispanic population. While this mostly mirrors large cities, there are nuances based on different races and ethnicities. A great example is the work that was NIH funded looking at cardiovascular disease. So a lot of our data is based on the Framingham Heart Study. This is a suburb outside of Boston, mostly white. This led the NIH to say we've got to focus on the Black US population to define risk factors and understand cardiovascular disease better. And where did they set that up? They set that Jackson Heart Study up in Jackson, Mississippi. The study is being conducted there because that's where the patients are. You go where the people are, you go where the patients are if you want to ensure success. And understanding that based on the different geographic trends is really important when you come up with your diversity plan. Next slide, please. However, it's not just geography. Even within the large buckets of race and ethnicity, there's even more diversity that comes into play when considering design of a clinical trial. If you want to do a hypertension or hyperlipidemia trial where the enrollment range is 18 to 80, let's say, age distribution by race might not matter as much. But the vast majority of the Black and Hispanic population fit under what we traditionally call the millennials or the Gen Z population, up to 23, up to 40. These ranges are incredibly important if you're aiming for a therapy for a rare disease in an older patient population. So taking race, geography, and age into account is incredibly important. This is all just to show that a true diversity plan has incredible nuance that is needed to ensure success. Next slide, please. We are a diverse population. That's all I've proven so far. But is the focus on diversity important? Is there a difference in disease burden when it comes to race and ethnicity? I could spend the entire talk on this, but the short answer is absolutely. We'll look at cardiology and oncology. Here, we show that the rates for age-adjusted rates for cancer deaths per 100,000 by race and ethnicity in 2018 was markedly different when you take race into account. Blacks were much more predisposed to dying of cancer than whites, Hispanics, and Asians. So if we're designing an oncology trial and we aren't talking about how to make sure we have Black enrollment, we're doing a disservice to the patients, the very patients we're trying to design this therapy for. Again, getting back to our goal being the right drug and device for the right patient at the right time. Next slide. When you look at cardiology, Black adults share a disproportionate burden of CV risk factors. Hypertension, diabetes, obesity, especially when you look at gender differences. And they experience earlier onset of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and have a shorter life expectancy. Despite this greater disease burden, Black, Indigenous, and people of color completely remain underrepresented in CV outcome trials. And I'll show you that data on the next slide. when you look at this data, so on the left is the US patient population back in the 2000 to 2010. So this is a little bit old data from the baseline US patient population. As we've described, this is now more homogeneous, more heterogeneous. But even if you look at this little bit of old data, what you quickly see is even though 72% of the US population is Caucasian, they comprise 94% of clinical trial participants. African Americans comprise 5%, Hispanics less than 1%. Next slide, please. And there's a difference between NIH-funded trials and industry-funded trials. So again, on the left, the total US population based on white versus all minorities grouped together. The NIH had a incentive. They really pushed the importance of diversity 20 years ago. And what you can see, the hope here is if you focus on diversity inclusion, you can start mirroring the US population. Unfortunately, industry-funded clinical trials still have a disproportionate burden where minorities aren't being fully represented. Next slide, please. I'd like to turn the conversation over to Dr. Matelier. She will talk about why this is the case, go over some pain points from the site and the patient perspective.
Thank you for joining us this morning. So next slide. So kind of reviewing this slide again, looking at race and clinical trials. So looking at our clinical participants. And one of the questions is, does cardiology do it better than maybe other disease specialties? Next slide. So this is actually a 10-year trend of actually looking at the past FDA approval of 35 novel cardiometabolic drugs. And as you can see is that women and minorities actually have a low percentage in terms of participants. 81% are non-Hispanic whites, while only 4% Black, 12% Asian, 11% Hispanic Latinx. And unfortunately, there hasn't been any significant improvement in the enrollment of racial or ethnic minorities over the time period. Next slide. So then we look at, in terms of participation and burden of disease. So there was an analysis, which was an elegant analysis, looking at randomized controlled trials of patients over 24 drugs involving 7 cardiovascular conditions, and it found only that 2.9% of Black adults actually participated in these randomized controlled trials. And unfortunately, the Black adult had a participation prevalence ratio of 0.29, indicating that they're poorly represented relative to their disease burden in the general population. And what they did was they actually looked at this, what we call a PPR ratio, dividing the percentage of people affected in the trial participants versus the disease population. Next slide. And this is basically going over and looking at different disease processes in terms of patients in acute MIs, atrial fibrillation, coronary artery disease, heart failure, hypertension, and it showed overall that the participation ratio for Blacks was 0.29, which was low compared to whites, which was 1.14. Next slide. And what's near and dear to my heart is heart failure. And so looking at our heart failure trials, our clinical trials, and in terms of looking at generalizability, the enrollment of racial and ethnic minorities in heart failure trials is also low. And as you can see, there are those 2 that are starred. And one of the reasons why there is a decrease in participation could be thought to be secondary to globalization of our heart failure clinical trials. However, the 2 trials that are starred, or the higher proportion of Black participants, were primarily based in North America. And what they did was there was an emphasis in trying to recruit in order to show a more reflection of our population in terms of the heart failure population and applicability. Next slide. So one of the things is figuring out more effective strategies. And the thought is that if you can get a 10 to 50% accrual rate of minority groups in clinical trials, this is required to enhance the enrollment of Black participants in cardiovascular clinical trials. And this is mostly based on oncology literature, who are a little bit more at the forefront of this in terms of increasing diversity. And multiple studies have actually shown that high enrollment of underrepresented populations did not influence study performance metrics. Next slide. And one of the thoughts is, how does this impact care? So one of the things that we have seen in terms of in the cardiology literature is that African Americans have a higher rate of platelet reactivity with antiplatelet drugs such as clopidogrel or Plavix, suggesting that there might be a pharmacogenetic variation in drug metabolism. And based on this, the higher on treatment platelet reactivity is an independent risk factor of a 12-month cardiovascular death and non-fatal MI. As a result, there might be also a higher prevalence of loss of function of a CYP allele. And this might be one of the reasons why we've seen increased mortality in African Americans post-MI. And could this be related to, in terms of metabolism? And when we're thinking about precision medicine, maybe we need to look in terms of these effects. And unfortunately, because these issues have been occurred, we didn't initially see this in the initial trials, secondary to under-enrollment of African American population. Next slide. And we also have seen this in terms of other ethnic groups. So a study that looked at sub-analysis of Asian Americans, that they actually were noted to have an increased bleeding in terms of warfarin. And the thought was that there was a higher frequency of a haplotype that may contribute to bleeding in Asians. And what ends up happening is that would this change in terms of what we do in terms of strategies to reduce side effects? However, if this was not initially addressed in terms of under-enrollment, we might not see this until patient-reported outcomes post-analysis, which could also lead to black box warnings of medications. Next slide. So why is it so hard to enroll? So in terms of in the African American population, there is what we call the Tuskegee legacy. So in 1932, working with the Tuskegee Institute, there was a study that looked at the natural history of syphilis. It was originally called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. Now it's just referred to as the Syphilis Study of Tuskegee. And what they did is they actually looked at 600 Black men, 399 with syphilis, 201 who did not have the disease. Participants' informed consent was not collected. Researchers were told the men they were being treated for bad blood, a local term used to describe several ailments, including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. In exchange of taking part of the study, the men received free medical care, free meals, and burial insurances. Unfortunately, informed consent was not collected, and as a result, there's, in terms of being experimented on, or the Tuskegee legacy still is become a metaphor for the abuse of research subjects in biomedical studies. And what, in terms of what we've seen recently in terms of COVID-19 and vaccinations, was related to a lot of references to this Tuskegee legacy. Next slide. There's also the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. This is another example in terms of where in 1951, a young mother of 5 was seen at Johns Hopkins complaining of vaginal bleeding. And she was noted to have cervical cancer and had a malignant tumor on her cervix. At that time, Johns Hopkins was the only few hospitals to treat poor African Americans. And one of the things that they had noticed when they did a biopsy was that her cells were able to be kept alive and grow. As a result, her cells were actually developed and called Hela cells and developed a legacy. Next slide. And these Hela cells are mostly known for the human cell line and have actually been used to develop the polio vaccine, and also in terms of helping with HIV identification in greater than 60,000 research papers related to this. And one of the things is that she was never consented in terms of using her cells, and her family also was unaware in terms of that her cells were being used in these cell lines. And it wasn't until the 1970s when there were some papers that came out in terms of what was going on into these Hela cell line collections, and the connection to Henrietta Lacks was that her family or her descendants were aware of this. Recently, there's been, in terms of a couple of books and movies related to Henrietta Lacks's contribution to in terms of cancer development and HPV and HIV. Next slide. So as a result, examples of distinct barriers. So in terms of for African Americans, there's a legacy of mistrust, the legacy of Tuskegee, the lack of research integrity, there's legacy of racism and discrimination in the health care system, and there's also concerns for the research process. For Asian Americans, a lot of times there's the thought of the lack of family support on the decision to participate and acculturation. And for Pacific Islanders, misrepresentation of community, and there's always a fear of overgeneralization. Next slide. And when we think about barriers in the Hispanic patients, one of the things that we always think about are screening and enrollments, difference in the primary language and cultural factors. Compared to non-Hispanic Latino white physicians, Latina physicians were significantly less involved in clinical trials, and this may also influence their decision to refer patients to clinical trials. And also, some trials specifically exclude non-English speakers, and content might not be culturally sensitive. And what some thoughts are also the presence of translators may distort the relationship between the study team and the patient, adding distance and an element of depersonalization. Next slide. So other things that we think about in terms of when we think about the barriers: health literacy, language, cultural differences, religion, limited access within the health care system, lack of clinical trial awareness, and what does it mean to participate in clinical trials? And what does participation mean in terms of, are they getting placebo? Are they getting standard of care? And what is actually involved in what is a clinical trial, and then not just being tested on as often patients are concerned about. Next slide. So one of the things that it has been apparent is just in terms of how do we increase the practices or improving enrollment of diverse populations in trials. So because of this mistrust of clinical research, the aspect of trial design and frequency of study visits, and one of the things is that we have to kind of change the old model in figuring out what do we do next. And because a lot of times patients, there's other factors that are not traditionally thought about. Could frequency of study visits impact their day-to-day care? Are there time and resource constraints for participants in terms of family responsibilities, and transportation and participation conflicting with maybe caregiver family responsibilities, or in terms of actually work and being excused from work in order to participate in terms of study visits. Next slide. So who does it better? So one of the things that is fascinating is that oncology has actually been the forefront in terms of figuring out how do we increase diversity or inclusion in these trials. So what they have done is they had a task force that looked at how do we increase inclusion. So what they have done is they developed centers of excellence, or in terms of cancer center selections. And what they did is they looked at sustainability of actual ethnic minorities in all cancer clinical trials, about 10 to 50%, an established minority population of greater than 10% of a total site catchment. There is a clinical trial infrastructure, and then data infrastructure or previous positive FDA audit, providers being bilingual or representative of the population they serve, existing diversity enrollment programs for clinical trials, a strong community outreach, cultural competency training, and the ability to participate in biomarker and metabolism research in terms of pharmacokinetic capabilities and tissue correlations. Next slide. And what they identified are these tenets in terms of leadership and commitment, investigator training and mentoring, community engagement, and patient engagement. Next slide. So why don't we enroll more diverse patients? And one of the things that we also need to think about is, where are other barriers? And so there was a survey that looked in terms of clinical trial administrators in terms of some of the barriers. And what they did is they saw that there might be interactions with potential minority patients were perceived to be challenging. Potential minority participants are not perceived to be ideal study candidates. And could there be a combination of clinic-based barriers and negative perceptions of minority study participants leads to clinical withholding clinical trial opportunities from potential minority participants? And when clinical trial recruitment practices were tailored to minority populations, addressing these misconceptions were to build trust was a common strategy. And then for some respondents, race was viewed as an irrelevant when screening and recruiting potential minority populations for clinical trials. Next slide. So now I want to pass that on to my colleague to discuss what are the solutions to help promote these patient diversity in clinical trials.
Thank you, Hansi. Well, to start discussing the solutions to the lack of diversity in clinical trial, I think we must have a clear picture of the different perspectives on the recruitment funnel here. Who designs the protocol perceives the recruitment funnel as the result of the inclusion-exclusion described in the protocol only, but who recruits participants and gets the chance to fully pre-screen charts and meet patients and discuss the trial opportunity finds out that there are exclusions there that goes beyond what is written in the protocol, and that makes the funnel more narrow. Next. So on the CRO level, what can we do? There are 4 areas that we can work on to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion: the study design, the site selection, the site support, and the patient support. Next. When we think about study design, how can we increase access? Well, there are methodologies that can be explored to allow more flexibility regarding eligibility criteria. For example, adaptive designs, broadening the inclusion criteria, and evaluating exclusions that may preclude the enrollment of underrepresented groups. For example, heart failure trials, a common criteria, inclusion criteria, is the level of proBNP. And we know there are racial variations on the level of the proBNP. The logistics of the study procedures is something that also must be taken into consideration. More complexity, the length of the study visits and follow-up, it will impact and require more investment to overcome possible barriers. Using technology, the extent use of technology may increase diversity, but that's something that we have to be careful to using and exploring this possibility. Do not end up excluding patients that do not have access to the internet or even access to mobile phone services. Next. How can we increase access? By selecting sites. So we have to take into consideration the geographic location of sites for all the reasons already presented here. Also, the diversity of the research team on the site level. Patients will need to feel represented. And we know that patients may be more inclined to enroll and follow up when they can interact better with the research team. The site referral sources. Does the site receive referrals from other areas? The community engagement of the site. This is something that we have to take into consideration when selecting sites. Next. How can we support sites? So creating awareness around diversity, equity, and inclusion, creating tools, providing resources to site, also providing study documents in multiple languages, offering translation services when needed, patient concierge services to overcome the logistics issues of studies, and providing incentives and support for the sites that wants to engage in community health fairs, sites that are willing to engage and provide education about clinical research, about the trial indication, and even conduct pre-screening procedures on these health fairs and community events. Next, how can we support the patient? Investing in a broad educational tool, using appropriate media will definitely be a key point here. Considering the low health literacy when developing patient-facing tools, keeping in mind that only 12% of Americans are health literate. Offering transportation. This is #1 reason for declining participation in research due to inconvenience of travel. Whenever possible, include study follow-up alternatives like mobile or home health services. Nurses and phlebotomists that can actually go home and help the patient overcome the transportation barrier or other issues. Considering the language barrier, culturally sensitive approach, offering transportation, patient reimbursement, and patient stipend, and seeking patient feedback, promoting patient engagement. These are points that will definitely support patient and increase their access to clinical research. Next. Well, now you may be thinking about the cost, right? The good news is that investing in ways to make clinical research more accessible will have a positive impact in enrollment overall. The enrollment curve will rise quicker than you expect, and losses about not meeting enrollment goals will be avoided. So there's actually data showing that studies that enrolled a more diverse patient population enrolled more, period. And diversity is not only important due to the applicability of the findings, but also promoting diversity may be the solution for the recruitment challenge in clinical research. That is actually #1 reason for the delay in trial completion. Next. And finally, solving the lack of diversity in research, it requires a multi-level approach. It requires change on the paradigm of clinical research, how we see clinical research. On the regulatory level, I believe they will probably continue to push. On the CRO sponsor level, we have to do our job by educating, creating alternatives, and thinking out of the box to create solutions and support site and patients. On the site level, investigators and the research staff also have to engage, to communicate, to create awareness. And last but not least, the patient. I think the patient is the #1 on this scale. He'll be the one that will let us know if it is working or not working. I'm gonna open up here for my colleagues to discuss and open also for questions. I thank you all for attending this webinar. It's been, a pleasure to share here this topic with my colleagues, Satya and Nancy. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. We have reached the Q&A portion of the webinar, so I'd like to invite our audience to continue sending in their questions or comments right now using the questions window. So I've already received a few questions and I will start with those. So our first question is for Satya. How much could a DEI plan impact a trial budget?
Sydney, and the person who asked the question, thank you so much. I think this is really important. A lot of times we see the focus on diversity as a expense. It's a cost driver. I think that paradigm is wrong. As Sarah and Hansi also beautifully laid out, it's not a dichotomy between efficiency and quality on one side and diversity and equity on the other side. If you focus on diversity, your enrollment will be better. If you focus on diversity, later delays with the FDA for not being able to enroll a diverse population won't happen. If you put it in from the ground and then build the trial, the site selection, the PI selection, all of the important considerations that go into how do you actually make sure patients of a diverse background actually enroll in clinical trials, if you take that into account, I don't see this as a cost driver. I see it as the way to drive efficiency. Again, this is one of the reasons we started off with the discussion about the US population. If you're going to not be able to offer a solution for 40 to 50% of the US population, it's going to be very hard to be efficient in clinical trial enrollment.
All right, thank you very much, Satya, for that answer. Our next question, would enrolling a more diverse patient population create study compliance and retention issues?
This is a very good question, actually, and there's data showing that trials that enrolled more African Americans and women, they did not have any impact in any study metrics. They did not compromise any of the study metrics, nothing that went beyond what is already expected or predicted. So this is something that we'll have to obviously invest in additional education, right? Retention starts at the enrollment. Right there, patient needs to be well educated about the study requirements and needs. We may have to support these patients with additional services, as we had already, exposed here, but we do not believe that will be an issue. At least that's not what recent data had been shown.
Thank you for that answer, Sarah. Our next question, what are you looking for in sites and a CRO partner to promote health equity?
I can take this. I think Dr. Matelier did a really good job laying out what the oncology networks have done. But to summarize it very briefly, when we go look at sites, it's not just a lip service to diversity. It's are you in an area from just from an epidemiology standpoint where you're going to have a diverse population? Are you able to break down based on the other variables, whether that's age, whether that's geography, whether that's gender, whether it's other variables, how to actually enroll for that specific clinical trial? Do you have a diverse PI base? Do you have a diverse CRA base? It's a combination of all of the above. Do you have an action plan to talk about how at an institution you're going to tackle the importance of making sure that you've got good enrollment from a diverse population? So we look at all of these things as site partners when we evaluate a site from a CRO perspective.
All right, thank you, Satya, for that answer. Our next question, besides race and ethnicity, what other population factors are considered unrepresented in clinical trials?
I can take this one. So, when we were kind of developing this webinar, one of the questions is whether or not should we also include women. So definitely we know that there is gender underrepresentation as well, and that could be its own seminar in itself. And one of the reasons that we know that women are sometimes underrepresented could be secondary to hormonal changes, or in terms of the effects on endocrine medications, and does that impact so that's definitely a population. If we look at those same trials for heart failure and cardiovascular, there's also an under-enrollment in the female population. Also often neglected are the elderly. They're often omitted from clinical trials, and there's often limited information on how treatment may affect the older patients. Also access in terms of patients that are maybe in a rural population. So those are definitely some vulnerable populations that we think about. So not only, patients that in terms of access to care if they're in a rural and maybe have to drive a long distance to have access to a clinical trial population.
All right, thank you all for those answers. That was our final question. So thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. We've reached the end of the Q&A portion of the presentation, but if we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Medpace may follow up with you, or if you have any further questions, you can direct them to the email address on your screen. So like I said, thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. And now a survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now please join us in thanking our speakers, Dr. Srinivas, Dr. Matelier, and Dr. Sampaio. We hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.